The wind came from nowhere, which was the problem with coastal weather in autumn. One moment the sky had been that perfect shade of grey that promised rain later, maybe tomorrow, and the next moment the clouds were black and moving like something alive and angry. Layla had exactly 4 minutes to save 3 months of data collection before the storm turned her research equipment into expensive debris. She grabbed what she could, shoving waterproof cases into her backpack with hands that were already shaking from adrenaline and cold. The portable computer went in first, then the sample containers, then the backup drives that held recordings of turtle nesting patterns she'd been tracking since July. The wind was screaming now, tearing at her jacket and throwing sand into her face with the enthusiasm of nature trying to make a point about human arrogance. The research tent collapsed behind her with a sound like fabric giving up on life. Layla didn't look back, just ran toward the rocky path that led inland, away from the beach where waves were already climbing higher than she'd ever seen them. Her boat was secured in the small harbor on the other side of the island, but reaching it meant crossing 2 kilometers of exposed coastline, and the sky was telling her in very clear terms that this was a terrible idea. The old lighthouse keeper's cottage appeared through the rain like a ghost made solid. Layla had passed it a dozen times during her research trips, always empty, always locked, a relic from when the island had an actual keeper instead of an automated beacon. Except now, impossibly, there was smoke coming from the chimney. She didn't care if it was haunted or occupied by smugglers or filled with feral cats. The storm was throwing rain sideways with enough force to bruise, and her weather app was showing wind speeds that made her think about her mortality in very specific ways. The door wasn't locked, which seemed like the universe giving her permission, so she pushed inside and stumbled into warmth and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. A man stood by the fireplace, turned to face her with a painter's brush still in his hand and an expression that suggested he was just as surprised as she was. They stared at each other for what felt like several years but was probably 3 seconds. The storm, Layla managed, water dripping from her hair onto the wooden floor. I didn't know anyone lived here. He set down the brush with deliberate care, like he was buying time to process the situation. I don't, officially. You're the marine biologist. I've seen you on the beach with the equipment. You've been watching me. The accusation came out sharper than she intended, but she was cold and scared and standing in a stranger's illegal cottage during what sounded like the apocalypse outside. I've been painting the coastline, he corrected, gesturing to the walls where canvases covered nearly every surface. You appear in the landscape sometimes. That's not the same as watching. Layla looked at the paintings properly for the first time. Seascapes rendered in blues and greys that captured something essential about loneliness. They were beautiful in the way that sad things could be beautiful, which told her more about the artist than she probably wanted to know. I'm Rashid, he said, still standing by the fireplace like he was ready to defend his territory. And before you ask, yes, I know I'm not supposed to be here. The Lighthouse Commission thinks the cottage is condemned. I've been very careful not to correct that assumption. Layla. She took off her backpack, which weighed approximately as much as a small car. I won't report you if you don't throw me back into the storm. Deal. Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. Deal. There's tea if you want it. Or something stronger if the storm has traumatized you sufficiently. The cottage was small, basically one room with a sleeping area separated by a curtain and a bathroom that probably violated several modern plumbing codes. A wooden table held painting supplies in organized chaos, and the fireplace provided the only heat source, which explained why Rashid was wearing 3 layers despite being indoors. Layla accepted the tea because her hands needed something warm to hold and because refusing hospitality from someone who was technically sheltering her from death seemed rude. The storm continued its assault on the building, rain hammering the roof with the dedication of water that had personal grievances. How long have you been living here? She asked, sitting in the only chair that wasn't covered in paint supplies. 4 months. Maybe 5. I stopped counting after the first few weeks. Rashid poured his own tea, remaining standing, maintaining distance. How long have you been studying turtles? 3 months this season. I'm tracking nesting patterns and documenting climate impact on hatchling survival rates. The familiar script of her research felt comforting, something normal in a situation that was becoming increasingly surreal. It's probably all ruined now. The equipment, the observation posts. 3 months of work gone in 20 minutes. The storm will pass, he said, which wasn't particularly helpful but was probably meant to be comforting. The island has survived worse. They fell into silence, interrupted only by the storm's continuous tantrum. Layla found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, cataloguing details the way she catalogued data. Late 30s, maybe 40. Dark hair going grey at the temples. Hands stained with paint and scarred in ways that suggested a history with sharp objects or rough work. Eyes that looked tired in a specific way, the kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for too long. He caught her looking, and instead of being awkward about it, he asked, "Are you hungry? I was making soup when you arrived. There's enough for two if you don't mind vegetables that came from a can." "I don't mind anything that's hot and edible," Layla said honestly, because the adrenaline was wearing off and she was starting to realize how cold she actually was. They ate in continued silence, but it was becoming a more comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand filling. The soup was basic but good, and the bread he served with it was only slightly stale. Outside, the storm showed no signs of losing interest in destroying everything. "You'll have to stay the night," Rashid said eventually, stating the obvious. "The path back to the harbor will be underwater by now, and even if it wasn't, walking it in this wind would be suicide." Layla had already reached that conclusion, but hearing it confirmed made it real in an uncomfortable way. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. You're surviving. There's a difference." He gestured to the sleeping area behind the curtain. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor by the fire." "That doesn't seem fair. I've slept in worse places, and you're the one who just outran a storm." "Consider it island hospitality." His tone suggested the discussion was over. They prepared for sleep with the awkwardness of strangers forced into unwanted intimacy. Layla changed into dry clothes from her emergency pack while Rashid gave her privacy, and when she emerged, he'd already laid out blankets by the fireplace and was adding more wood to keep the flames alive. "Rashid," she said, because the situation felt like it needed acknowledgement. "Thank you. For not being a serial killer or a ghost. That would have really complicated my evening." He almost smiled, she was sure of it. "Thank you for not being a government inspector. That would have complicated mine." She lay in the bed that smelled like wood smoke and solitude, listening to the storm rage and the fire crackle and the quiet sounds of another person breathing in the darkness. It should have been uncomfortable, but instead it felt strangely safe, like the universe had pushed them together for reasons that would probably make sense eventually. Tomorrow she'd worry about her research and her ruined equipment and the practical impossibility of sharing a tiny cottage with a stranger. Tonight, she just closed her eyes and let the storm sing its violent lullaby, and somehow, despite everything, she slept. Morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only comes after violence, when nature is catching its breath and pretending it never lost control. Layla woke to pale light filtering through salt-stained windows and the smell of coffee, which seemed impossible given the cottage's apparent lack of modern amenities. Rashid was already awake, standing by the window with a mug in his hands, watching the grey sea like it owed him answers. He didn't turn when she stirred, but his voice acknowledged her presence. "The storm broke an hour ago. There's coffee if you want it, though I should warn you it's the kind that could strip paint." Layla sat up, her body reminding her about yesterday's sprint through the weather. "Paint-stripping coffee sounds perfect actually." He'd set out a second mug on the table, steam rising in lazy spirals. She wrapped her hands around it and took a sip that confirmed his warning. The coffee was aggressive enough to make her teeth hurt, but it was hot and caffeinated and that was enough. "I checked the path to the harbor," Rashid said, still looking out the window. "It's passable but not safe. Another few hours and the ground will be stable enough for walking without risking your neck. So I'm stuck here a bit longer." Layla tried to sound disappointed but wasn't entirely successful. There was something about the cottage in daylight, something peaceful despite the chaos it had sheltered them from. "There are worse places to be stuck." He finally turned to face her, and in the morning light she could see details she'd missed last night, the fine lines around his eyes, the way his paint-stained fingers curled around his mug like he was anchoring himself to something solid. "I was going to make breakfast. Eggs and whatever else survived my shopping trip from 2 weeks ago." They cooked together in the small space, moving around each other with the careful choreography of people trying not to acknowledge how domestic it felt. Rashid cracked eggs into a pan that had seen better decades, while Layla found bread that was still edible and butter that hadn't turned into a science experiment. "Can I ask you something?" Layla said, because the silence felt like it was waiting for words. "Why here? Why hide in a condemned cottage on an island where the nearest town is an hour by boat?" Rashid didn't answer immediately, focusing on the eggs with more attention than they required. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like he was testing each word before releasing it. "2 years ago, my wife died. Cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't care about treatment or hope or any of the things you're supposed to have." He flipped the eggs with practiced efficiency. "Afterwards, everyone kept telling me to move on, to heal, to find meaning. But our apartment still smelled like her perfume and the city was full of places we'd been together, and I couldn't breathe properly anymore." Layla set down the knife she'd been using to slice bread, giving him her full attention. "So I left," he continued. "Packed my painting supplies and found the most remote place I could access without requiring permits or explanations. The Lighthouse Commission had condemned this cottage 5 years ago, which meant nobody checked on it. I've been here since June, painting the sea and trying to remember how to exist." "I'm sorry," Layla said, and meant it in a way that went beyond polite condolence. "About your wife. About all of it." "Thank you." He served the eggs onto mismatched plates. "Your turn now. What's a marine biologist doing alone on an island studying turtles like her life depends on it?" Layla laughed, but it came out bitter. "Running away, apparently, though I've been calling it research to make it sound noble." She took a bite of eggs, buying time. "I was supposed to get married last year. Had the venue booked, the dress altered, the whole performance planned out. Then 3 months before the wedding, I discovered my fiancé had been cheating with my research partner. Not just once, but for 8 months, while we were all working on the same conservation project." "That's spectacularly terrible," Rashid said with the bluntness of someone who'd lost patience with sugarcoating pain. "It gets better. When I confronted them, they said they'd fallen in love and couldn't help it, like gravity had forced them into bed together repeatedly. Then my fiancé had the audacity to ask if we could still be friends because breaking up the research team would be awkward." Layla shook her head, still amazed by the memory. "I quit the project, turned down a promotion, and applied for this solo field study specifically because it required living alone on an island for 6 months. Seemed like good therapy." "Has it been?" "Honestly, I have no idea. I've been so focused on data collection that I haven't had time to process anything. Which might be the point." She met his eyes across the small table. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Hiding on an island from our respective disasters." "At least we're honest about it," Rashid said. "That's more than most people manage." They finished breakfast and, by unspoken agreement, decided to spend the day exploring while the weather held. Rashid wanted to check on his favorite painting spot to see if the storm had changed the landscape, and Layla needed to assess the damage to her research sites. The island looked different after the storm, sharper somehow, like the wind had stripped away pretense and left only essential elements. They walked the coastal path together, Rashid pointing out places where he'd set up his easel and Layla explaining turtle nesting behaviors with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved her subject. "You light up when you talk about them," Rashid observed as they climbed toward the cliffs. "The turtles. Your whole face changes." Layla felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cool air. "They're incredible creatures. Some of them travel thousands of kilometers to return to the exact beach where they were born. They navigate using the Earth's magnetic field and maybe the stars, we're still not entirely sure. But they come home, no matter how far they've gone." "Maybe that's what we're all trying to do," Rashid said quietly. "Find our way back home, even when we're not sure where that is anymore." They reached the cliff edge where wind had carved the rocks into dramatic formations. Rashid's easel was still there, miraculously intact, though several blank canvases had blown away. He stood at the edge, looking out at the churning water, and Layla saw something in his posture that looked like a man considering jumping. She moved closer without thinking, not touching but present. "You okay?" "I used to come here every morning," he said. "My wife, Nadia, she loved the ocean. Grew up in a coastal town and never lost that pull toward water. When she was sick, toward the end, She made me promise I wouldn't stop painting. Said it would be a waste if I let grief kill the one thing that made me feel alive. You kept that promise. I'm trying to. Some days it feels like keeping it is all I have left of her. He turned to look at Layla, really look at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. But yesterday, when you burst through that door soaking wet and furious at the weather, it was the first time in 2 years I felt something that wasn't just obligation to a dead woman's wishes. I felt curious, interested, almost alive. Layla's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. Rashid. I know, he interrupted. I know it's too soon and too complicated and we're basically strangers who happen to share soup during a storm. But I need you to know that meeting you reminded me that feeling things is possible, even when you've convinced yourself you're finished with all that. The wind pulled at their clothes, and the sea continued its endless conversation with the rocks below. Layla reached out and took his hand, his fingers rough with calluses and paint stains, and held on. I came to this island to hide, she said. To prove to myself that I didn't need anyone, that I could be complete on my own. And maybe that's true, maybe I can be. But yesterday you gave me shelter and soup and honesty, and this morning you made terrible coffee and told me about Nadia, and I realized something. What? That hiding is easier than healing, but it's not the same thing. And I'm tired of choosing easy. Rashid squeezed her hand, and they stood there on the cliff's edge with the wind trying to push them back towards safety, both of them learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're terrified of hope. They walked back to the cottage as afternoon painted the sky in shades of gold and grey, and neither of them mentioned that eventually Layla would have to leave, that her boat was waiting and her research demanded continuation. Those were problems for later, for tomorrow or the day after. Tonight, there was soup to make and coffee to drink and 2 people trying to remember what it felt like to want something beyond survival. The third morning arrived with perfect clarity, the kind of weather that made the storm seem like something imagined. Layla woke to find Rashid already painting by the window, his brush moving across canvas with focused precision, capturing the way light turned water into liquid silver. She watched him for a moment before speaking, memorizing the concentration on his face, the way his paint-stained hands moved with absolute certainty. This, she realized, was what he looked like when he wasn't haunted by loss, when he was simply himself doing the thing he loved. You're awake, he said without turning, somehow sensing her attention. I was going to let you sleep. The sea is calm enough for crossing now. Your boat should be fine. The words hung between them like an accusation neither wanted to make. Layla sat up slowly, already feeling the weight of departure pressing against her ribs. I should check my equipment, she said, because logistics were easier than emotions. Assess the damage, file a report with the research foundation. They'll want to know if the study can continue or if 3 months of work just became an expensive learning experience. Rashid set down his brush and finally looked at her, his dark eyes holding questions he wasn't quite asking. And after that? You have 3 more months scheduled on the island. Technically, yes. If the equipment survived and the nesting sites aren't completely destroyed. Layla pushed hair out of her face, buying time. Rashid, we should probably talk about what happens next. I've been thinking about that all morning, he admitted, moving to sit on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain space between them. Actually, I've been thinking about it since you told me I make terrible coffee and then drank 3 cups anyway. Despite everything, Layla smiled. It really is aggressively bad coffee. Nadia used to say the same thing. She tried to teach me proper brewing techniques, but I never quite mastered the patience required. He looked down at his hands, paint embedded under his fingernails in permanent decoration. I haven't talked about her this much since she died. Everyone else gets uncomfortable, like grief is contagious and they might catch it if I speak her name too often. Grief isn't something you catch, Layla said softly. It's something you carry. And maybe talking about her means you're finally ready to set down some of that weight. Rashid met her eyes, and the vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. I told myself I came here to honor her memory, to paint because she asked me to. But I think I really came here to stop existing as anything except the man whose wife died. It was easier than trying to be a whole person again. And now? Now I'm terrified, he said with brutal honesty. Because these 3 days with you, hiding from a storm and drinking bad coffee and talking about turtles and dead wives and betrayals. These have been the first days in 2 years where I felt like a person instead of a monument to loss. And I don't know what to do with that. Layla shifted closer, closing the careful distance between them. I'm terrified too. My last relationship ended with public humiliation and professional disaster. Every logical part of my brain is screaming that getting involved with someone I met 3 days ago while hiding from a storm is the definition of terrible judgment. But, Rashid prompted, something almost hopeful flickering in his expression. But logic didn't save me from heartbreak last time, and hiding on an island studying turtles hasn't actually healed anything, it's just delayed the processing. Maybe terrible judgment is exactly what I need right now. She took his hand, the gesture becoming familiar. I like you, Rashid. I like how you paint sadness into something beautiful and how you don't pretend grief has an expiration date. I like that you noticed me on the beach before we ever spoke and that you make soup from canned vegetables like it's gourmet cooking. I like you too, he said, and the simple statement carried more weight than elaborate declarations. You burst into my isolation with scientific enthusiasm and zero patience for my dramatic cliff-edge brooding. You talk about turtles like they're miracles, and you are miracles, and you look at my paintings like you actually see what I'm trying to say with them. The morning light made everything feel both more real and more fragile. Layla could hear gulls crying outside, the world continuing its rotation regardless of human complications. So what do we do? She asked. I live 4 hours away in a city apartment full of research papers and bad memories. You live illegally in a condemned cottage, hiding from a world that wants you to move on faster than you're ready for. We're geographically impossible and emotionally complicated, and we've known each other for 72 hours. Rashid was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. I've been thinking about leaving the island. Not right away, but soon. I told myself I'd stay until I finished a series of paintings, but really I've just been postponing the decision to rejoin life. Seeing you these past days, watching how passionate you are about your work, it reminded me that hiding forever isn't the same as healing. Where would you go? Back to the city, probably. My old studio is still there, though I've been paying rent on it without setting foot inside for months. I could actually use it again, try to reconnect with the galleries that used to show my work. He paused, then added with careful casualness, it's about 3 hours from where you live. I checked the map this morning. Layla's heart performed acrobatics. You checked the map? I did. Seemed relevant to my decision-making process. He finally smiled properly, and it transformed his whole face into something younger, less burdened. I'm not suggesting we immediately move in together or make dramatic pronouncements about forever. But maybe we could try something terrifying like dating. Actual dating, where we see each other on purpose and figure out if this thing between us survives contact with normal life. That sounds absolutely terrifying, Layla agreed. And also like exactly what I want. They sat there on the bed in the cottage that had sheltered them both from more than just weather, holding hands like teenagers figuring out romance for the first time. Outside, the sea continued its eternal rhythm, waves that had been crashing against rocks long before their problems existed and would continue long after. I should warn you, Rashid said eventually. I'm probably going to be terrible at this. I haven't dated anyone since Nadia, and even that wasn't really dating since we met in university and basically never separated until cancer separated us. I don't know the protocols or the modern expectations. I should warn you, Layla countered, that I'm going to overthink everything and probably panic at least twice about whether this is a terrible rebound mistake. And I'll spend the next 3 months on this island obsessing over turtle data, which means limited phone signal and conversations interrupted by hatchling emergencies. I can work with turtle emergencies, Rashid said seriously. They sound important. They're very important. Then we have a plan. You finish your research season. I pack up my painting supplies and stop hiding from condemned building inspectors. In 3 months, we both return to the mainland and attempt the revolutionary concept of building something together instead of running away separately. Layla leaned in and kissed him, soft and tentative, a question more than a statement. He kissed her back with careful intensity, his hand coming up to cup her face like she was something precious that might break. When they pulled apart, Both of them were smiling with the nervous hope of people who decided to be brave. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for departure, Rashid helping Layla check her equipment and assess storm damage while she offered suggestions for packing his paintings safely. The research gear had survived better than expected, the waterproof cases earning their inflated price tags, and most of the nesting observation posts could be repaired with basic tools and determination. At the dock, with Layla's boat rocking gently in calm water, they stood facing each other with the awareness that this was both an ending and a beginning. 3 months, Layla said, making it a promise. 3 months, Rashid confirmed. I'll paint you the ocean and you'll save the turtles and we'll both practice being people who choose hope over hiding. Deal. She kissed him one more time, tasting coffee and possibility, then climbed into her boat. Rashid stood on the dock watching as she started the motor and began the journey back to her research station on the far side of the island. She looked back once to see him still standing there, a lonely figure against the bright morning, and felt something in her chest that might have been fear or might have been excitement or might have been both. The island that had given them shelter now stretched between them, but 3 months wasn't forever, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Layla found herself looking forward to the future instead of just surviving the present. Behind her, in the cottage that would soon be empty again, Rashid returned to his painting with renewed purpose, capturing light on water and beginning the difficult work of coming back to life. On the opposite shore, Layla unloaded her equipment and started rebuilding her research stations, discovering that fixing broken things was easier when you had something to look forward to. The storm had passed, and in its wake, 2 people who'd been drowning separately had found something worth swimming toward together.